Part 5, Section 1, Chapter 10 of Short History of the Christian Church by John Fletcher Hurst. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 10, Education. The educational spirit of the first colonists was intense. The Virginia colony numbered among its members men who had been thoroughly educated, and whose associations and tastes fitted them for an appreciation of the value of education to their posterity. The New England colonists, while not from an equally elevated social position in the Old World, were far more devoted to literary pursuits, and were more keenly alive to the importance of culture for the well-being of the population. It was the authorship of the Pilgrims which caused their exile in Holland. They had written, and therefore they had to suffer. John Robinson, their pastor, was a disputant against Episcopius in the University of Leyden. His writings, which have been preserved, were such as to aid largely in moulding the New England mind in its most plastic period. Brewster was both publisher and author. The records of Winthrop, Morton, and others show the skill with which the first Puritans of New England knew how to use the pen. One half of their ministers were graduates of Oxford or Cambridge. Divines like Mather, Cotton, and James Hooker were men of great ability and learning. One of the first thoughts of the New England colonists was elementary education for their children. The first common school was established in New England about 1640, and became the herald of all the common schools in the United States. "Salem had a free school in 1640, Boston in 1642, Cambridge about the same time, and the State in 1647 marked out an elaborate system of common and grammar schools." Instruction was gratuitous, the expenses being met by direct tax on the inhabitants of the town. Schools of various grades sprang up in all parts of the New England colonies, though Boston very early became the centre. In 1635 an appropriation was made for Pourmont as schoolmaster. 6 years afterwards the foundation was laid in the same place for the celebrated public Latin school. Academies sprang rapidly into existence. Here young men were prepared for Harvard, Yale, and similar institutions. Harvard College was the first institution of advanced learning in the American colonies. It was founded in 1636 for the special purpose of a theological school for the benefit of posterity, "fearing an illiterate ministry." The General Court had already voted £400 for a public school. The Rev. John Harvard, of Charlestown, made a bequest of over $1,800 as an endowment to the school. He also donated 320 volumes as the beginning of a library. It was called a college, and the name of Harvard, its principal benefactor, was given to it. The name of Newtown, where it was located, was changed to Cambridge, in honor of the University of Cambridge, where many of the New England Puritan fathers had been educated. The legislature ordered that the income of Charlestown Ferry should be granted the college as a perpetual revenue. The Rev. Henry Dunster was appointed the president. The mottoes of the college were, "In gloriam Christi," for the glory of Christ; "Christo et Ecclesiae," to Christ and his church. The college received its first charter in 1650. That the first idea of the founding of Harvard as a theological school was never lost sight of during its early period may be seen in the fact that during the first century of its history 317 of its alumni became ministers of the gospel. Its first professorship was that of divinity, established by Thomas Hollis, an English Baptist layman, in 1721. This institution and its great success led to similar ones in other parts of New England. Yale followed in 1701, Brown in 1764, Dartmouth in 1769, Burlington in 1791, and Bowdoin in 1795. The first important educational movement in Virginia was an undertaking to found the University of Henrico, for the education of English and Indians. This began within a few years after the settlement in Jamestown. Friends in England took pains to collect funds for the purpose. The Bishop of London gave £1,000 sterling for the new institution of learning, and another contributor presented £500 for educating young Indians. The preacher at Henrico, the Reverend Mr. Bargrave, donated his library. A school preparatory to the university was proposed, to be located at St. Charles City, to be called the East India School, the first gift having been made by the officers and crew of an East India ship. This whole movement failed because of the Indian massacre of 1622. The colonists, however, never lost sight of the founding of a higher institution of learning. Occasionally they had to contend with the opposition of those who governed them. Sir William Berkeley, in 1670, resisted an application of the Lords of Plantation in the following language: "I thank God there are no schools nor printing, and I hope we shall not have them these 100 years. For learning has brought disobedience and heresy and sects into the world, and printing has divulged them and libels against the best government. God keep us from both." But the educational demand could not be resisted, and William and Mary College arose as the first successful attempt to establish an institution of high grade in Virginia. It was founded in 1693. As Harvard College grew out of the great success of the pastoral labors of the Reverend Thomas Shepard, so the College of William and Mary grew out of the long and arduous labors of the Reverend Dr. Blair. This institution became the most important educational center in all the Southern colonies. During the entire colonial period, it was the place where many of the statesmen and clergy of Virginia were educated. Its power was felt, not only in that one colony, but in the leadership which led to the War of Independence. The remaining colonies were far behind New England in educational measures. New York had its Dutch teachers early, but it was not until 1746 that its first great college, Columbia, was founded. Princeton, for New Jersey, was founded in the same year. Dickinson, at Carlisle, was established in 1783 to meet the wants of the rural population in the valleys of the Cumberland and the Susquehanna. The first provision in Maryland for a school was in 1723. No school of college grade was established in Georgia or the Carolinas before the Revolution. Much of the instruction given throughout the Southern colonies was private. The planters took care to have good tutors from England brought over and placed in charge of their sons. The tutors lived on the plantations, in the families where they taught. Governesses were provided for the daughters of the planters. This method of education seems to have been preferred to the schools of higher grade. We cannot infer from the absence of such foundations in the South that education was neglected. For the great mass of the people there was no good provision. But for the more wealthy there was ample provision in this private system of instruction. The planters had not only their tutors, but they were attentive to the instruction of the best works in all departments of European literature. The libraries in the homes of the planters of Virginia and other Southern colonies, during the colonial period, were in some cases magnificent. Books from the European press were constantly arriving. Besides, many young men went over to Europe for an education. The fashion of young Americans attending the foreign universities seems to have had its origin in the South, and particularly in South Carolina, during the colonial period. End of chapter 10.